In 17 years at Alabama, Nick Saban dominated college football in a way that few have. He won 88% of his games with the Tide, and going back to in his time at LSU, he won 7 national championships and made an additional 9 BCS or playoff appearances in his last 22 years as a college coach. If you got into college football in the last 2 decades, then that's the only Saban you've known, but it wasn't always that way. Back in the 90s, in his first 4 years as head coach at Michigan State, his record was barely over 500, he'd lost all 3 of his bowl games, and one AP writer called him, quote, the most overrated coach in the country. In this 2-part series, we're going to see how Saban went from that to being arguably the best coach in the history of the college game. Along the way, we'll see all the Hall of Famers and Super Bowl winners that helped him develop his program philosophy and defensive scheme. We'll look at the highs and lows from the beginning of his career up to his first national championship at LSU, and we'll even learn about the only time that he ever got fired. So stay tuned, because this is the Coordinator Project, and you're watching the first video of the series, Becoming Saban. When you look at all the coaching trees that Nick Saban's been a part of, and at the star-studded group of guys that molded him, it can almost feel like he was destined to be a Hall of Famer. Of course, life doesn't work that way. Plenty of people work for great coaches and never have Saban's level of success, and that's because no mentor can make you elite unless you bring a lot to the table yourself. When it comes to Saban, we need to understand that in some important ways, he'd already become Saban before he ever set foot on a college field. When we're talking about his early life and about his first experience with football, the man who really set Saban's approach to the game in motion was his father, Nick Sr., or Big Nick, as many who knew the family called him. As a heads up, a lot of the biographical information that you're going to see here comes from Monty Burke's biography of Saban. This video will focus on scheme, film study, and football history, but if you want more of Saban's life and his career off the field, Burke's book is great, and I'll link to it, as well as any other books that I mention here in the description down below. Big Nick grew up in Marion County in West Virginia coal country. There, his father worked in a mine, and from an early date, Big Nick decided that his main goal was to stay out of the mines himself. He played baseball and football in high school, and later on some minor league baseball as well. Not long after graduation, he started a business, Saban's Service Station, where his son would go on to develop much of his work ethic, character, and yes, perfectionism. According to Burke, Saban tells stories of washing cars for his dad and having to rewash an entire vehicle if he missed so much as a spot. Childhood friend and teammate Donnie Evans remembers a story of Big Nick asking his son and some friends to clean out a drain. He wouldn't quit until it was absolutely spotless. We were telling him, come on man, it's fine, let's go, it's cold. But Nick said, we're gonna do it right. I don't want to listen to it later on. If you've ever seen Saban on the sideline chewing somebody out late in a blowout game, just know that according to his sister, he is, quote, 50% as intense as his father was. Different kids might respond to Big Nick's style of tough parenting in different ways, but for Nick Jr., it was always a source of motivation. In 1997, when he opened a car dealership in Nashville, he dedicated it to his father's memory.
I learned a lot from my dad, but everything that our business model stands for is what he stood for, that I learned from him growing up, and that's certainly what we're going to try to implement here.
On the field, Big Nick also became his son's first football coach when he started a Pop Warner team called the Black Diamonds, even going so far as to buy a bus to pick up the players and drive them to and from practice so that they wouldn't have to walk or hitchhike. The team did so well over the years that Bobby Bowden, when he was coaching at West Virginia, would stop by to talk to Big Nick about players that he was recruiting. As Mark Manchin, a player on some of those teams, remembers, he drove us really hard, but Nick Sr. was a great coach. I cannot say anything clearer. With his attention to detail and knowledge of the game, I think he could have been a college coach. Together, Saban and his father would sometimes go to West Virginia practices and games, talking over plays, formations, and strategy together. Kerry Marbury, a Black Diamond who went on to play for the Mountaineers, remembers staying over at the Saban house where the two Nicks would watch film together. They'd ask me if I wanted to join them. I'd say no thanks. The two of them would sit there and watch for hours and love it. In time, Nick Jr. moved on to his high school team where he dreamed of playing his college ball at West Virginia. He was a leader and an effective player and started at quarterback on a state championship team as a senior. He also made the all-state teams in both basketball and baseball, but when it came to his dream of playing for the Mountaineers, he was, in his own words, not good enough. After graduation, he briefly considered going to the Naval Academy and even got a senatorial nomination to do so. Spending 5 years in the service after graduation, though, in the middle of the Vietnam War, gave him cause to reconsider, and in the fall of 1969, he enrolled at Kent State to play for a former Division III coach named Dave Puddington. Originally, Saban hoped to compete at quarterback on Kent State's freshman team, but his lack of size and lack of arm strength made this goal unlikely, and so he started making the switch to safety, where he'd play out the rest of his college career. No matter where Saban was playing, Puddington struggled at Kent State, and after Saban's sophomore season, he resigned with an overall record of 9-21. At that point, Saban, as a converted safety on a losing team, hardly seemed destined for the Hall of Fame, but that would all change with what happened next. After Dave Puddington stepped down as Kent State's head coach, the school replaced him with new hire Don James, a coach who would later go on to win a national championship at Washington before being inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. In 1971, though, he was a first-time head coach who'd spent most of the 60s as a defensive coordinator and defensive backs coach at schools like Florida State, Michigan, and Colorado. In James, Saban found a coach whose organization and attention to detail were a perfect match for the upbringing that he'd gotten from his father. Gary Pinkel, who was a teammate of Saban's and a longtime college coach in his own right, described James' influence on Saban before Alabama's 2016 matchup with Washington in the playoffs. "I know Coach James would be proud because it's his infrastructure. Coach James was an organizational genius, and Nick's the same way. If you're going to run any organization at the highest level, you've got to make every day important and solve problems daily, and not weekly or monthly. Coach James taught us that." In the same article, Saban put it this way: "He meant so much to me and so much to my career. A lot of what we do from an organizational standpoint and practice standpoint came directly from Coach James." While James' organizational influence on Saban is often mentioned, less has been said about his impact on Saban's early schematic development, and here it's important to know a little bit about what was going on in defensive football in the 60s and early 70s. During that time, college coverage structures were going through a major upheaval thanks to passing attacks that were becoming more and more dangerous. This coverage crisis is described in a paragraph from a 1972 book by Sam DeLuca, who played for the Chargers and the Jets in the 60s, and talks about the inadequacies of traditional college zones. The zone defense has long been the basic coverage used at the high school and college levels. The weakness of the zone is that there are not enough people to cover all the flat, short, and hook zones. It's generally accepted as being true that any good quarterback, given time, can pick apart the pure zone by hitting his receivers with these flat, short, and hook passes. The zone's traditionally been popular at the high school and college levels because there are few good passers to be found there. They're not relying on the basic soundness of zone coverage, but on the unrefined passing of most young quarterbacks. DeLuca's book was published during Saban's senior year in college, at a time when professional football had been opening up for a few decades. We can see where football been if we go back to, say, 1940, where a common offensive formation would have been something like this: a single wing set with all 11 players lined up tight to the core of the formation. Teams could split guys out wide or motion them out of the backfield, but in most cases those were variations and not the main attraction. By the 1950s, you see more and more of this at the pro level, with 2 backs in the backfield and 2 or even 3 receiving threats split out wide. In combination with these new wide receiving threats, a modern passing game was developing to get those guys the ball and to stress defenses in more and more effective ways. By the late 60s, these trends from the pro game were starting to work their way into high schools and colleges, forcing defenses to adapt. We can get an idea of how college coaches were dealing with this from Jack Olcott, a defensive backs coach who held jobs at Boston College, Boston University, and several smaller schools in the late 60s. He published a book on pass defense in 1970, Saban's sophomore season at Kent State, and described the college passing game like this: "Many college passing attacks today have reached the heights that the professional football teams reached 10 years ago. Each year, it seems that we're facing more wide pro offenses. Pragmatically speaking, the improvement of the passing game has forced the defensive coordinators into using a multiple series of blitzing, zone, man-to-man, and combination defensive pass coverage techniques to combat the emphasis being placed on the pass. Since the offensive attack is equipped with hundreds of offensive variations, the defense must also use several variations to attack each offensive formation to keep the signal caller guessing." You can find a similar idea in the autobiography of Don James himself, where he describes coaching at Florida State in the early 60s. "We threw the ball a lot at Florida State, particularly when we had Steve Tenzi passing to Fred Biletnikoff. Others were doing the same thing. Joe Namath was at Alabama, and Steve Spurrier was at Florida. We had to defend the whole field against all the formations that you see today. We had to be in a number of different coverages and had to play well if you wanted to be successful." When Don James came to Kent State, therefore, Saban didn't just get an organizational genius. He got a mentor who'd fought on the front lines against a rapidly spreading pro-passing attack, and who'd done so as a defensive coordinator and defensive back coach in the toughest college conferences. James was part of the first generation of college coaches that really had to figure all this stuff out, and Saban was able to inherit that experience and run with it. But what did a multiple coverage defense actually look like in 1972? At the time, coaches typically talked about three broad types of coverage, and here we'll see each of them in actual film of the Kent State defense that Saban played in. So if you've ever wanted to see what Nick Saban looked like as a college player, here's your chance. Right now, we're looking at the 1972 game between Kent State and Ohio, and Saban will be number 12, the weak side safety, in all of these clips. Also, fun fact, the middle linebacker in this defense is future Pro Football Hall of Famer Jack Lambert, who went on to win 4 Super Bowls in 11 years with the Steelers. By the way, if you like this kind of historical stuff, I just launched a Patreon site where I'll be uploading videos with a lot more detail about the strategy of the game, how it's changed over time, and the coaches that were most important in developing it. Right now, I'm working on a few projects on the early modern passing game and pass coverage, so if you're into that kind of thing, check out patreon.com/tcpfootball for more. But back to the coverage. The first type that we'll talk about is zone, and in the early 70s, that almost always meant a 3 deep, 4 underneath coverage like this one. Today we'd call it cover 3, but back then it was often just zone. In this coverage, 3 of your defensive backs will divide the deep field into thirds, with 2 covering the deep sidelines, while a third patrols the deep middle. Your 4th defensive back then, if you had one, would drop down into underneath coverage where he'd work with the 3 linebackers to defend the underneath zones, with 2 defenders in the short outside zones called the flats, and 2 defenders in the short inside zones called the hooks. There were other zone shells out there at this point, including some 2 deep and 4 deep coverages, but you kind of had to go looking for them. They weren't yet a standard part of the coverage package for most teams. Along with zone, the second big coverage category was man, and the default here was a version of what we'd call cover 0 today. This was a 4 across man-to-man defense with the cornerbacks covering the wide receivers, the strong safety covering the tight end, and the weak safety, who's Saban in this case, covering the running back to his side if he releases out of the backfield. That's usually what people meant when they talked about just plain man coverage, but there were also a number of so-called free safety coverages. In those looks, responsibility for that running back the Saban's covering would be switched to the weak side linebacker, who'd cover him in place of that safety. With that linebacker covering the running back, the weak safety was then freed up to work as a deep help player, and in that role he could do a number of things depending on his own team's coverage philosophy, the defensive play call, and that week's game plan. The third big category was what was called combination coverage, and the definition and look of these coverages could change quite a bit from coach to coach. One common definition, though, was exactly what it sounded like. These were coverages where some defenders were playing zone, while others were playing man. Here, for example, we're going to see a combination coverage with Saban playing as a free safety. As we just saw, that means that he doesn't have any man coverage assignment, and so he's free to drop as a help player in the deep middle of the field. Down at the bottom of the screen, we see man coverage with the cornerback playing bump and run on his wide receiver, while the strong safety rolls down to cover this receiver on the wing. The strong side linebacker then is going to line up over that receiver, and he's going to chuck or collision him, shrinking the amount of space that safety has to defend by preventing his man from getting cleanly off the line of scrimmage and into the middle of the field. Once that linebacker's done this, he's going to pick up the near side running back man-to-man as soon as that guy releases out of the backfield. That's the man side then. Up at the top of the screen, Kent State's playing zone against Ohio's tight end and weak side running back. This means that after the snap, the outside linebacker is going to drop out to defend the short outside zone in the flats. While the cornerback drops out to play a deep outside third over the top. With Ohio's receiving threats accounted for in this way, that frees up future Pro Football Hall of Famer Jack Lambert to run through the line for the quarterback sack. Okay, so that was the basic coverage package of the early 70s, and if you're used to the modern coverage world, it might sound a little bit simple. Today, you'll hear commentators talk about things like cover 0, cover 1, cover 2, Tampa 2, 2-man, cover 3, quarters, quarter, half, and so on, and it's not uncommon for a team to have some version of all of these in the playbook, even if they only specialize in a few of them. Well, a typical 1970s defense didn't have that variety of different coverage shells. Within each coverage, they did have a variety of tools and adjustments that they could mix in depending on down, distance, offensive tendencies, formations, personnel, backfield action, and so on. And in this way, they could be much more modern and sophisticated than they might seem at first. On this play, for example, Kent State's playing a 3-deep, 4-under zone, so Saban at that weak safety spot, along with his 2 cornerbacks, will drop out and divide the deep field into thirds. In underneath coverage, the strong safety is executing what we would call a sky rotation today, meaning that he's dropping down to play one of those short outside zones in the flat. If you're curious about that term sky, when you're talking about cover 3, it's common to use a tag to tell you which player is rotating into that short outside zone. Sky and safety both start with the letter S, and so cover 3 sky tells us that a safety is rotating into that zone. There are other tags that would put different players there, so cover 3 cloud would put a cornerback in the flat, telling the strong safety to bail out and replace him as a deep outside third defender down the sideline. And cover 3 buzz would put a backer out there, and that'd tell the strong safety to rotate down and replace him in the inside hook. I should add here, Don James didn't invent these different coverage rotations. You can already see them at least as early as Bear Bryant's book from 1960, where his base zone coverage is what I've called cover 3 cloud, and then he has 2 what he calls secondary stunts, thunder and gangster, that are basically 3 sky and 3 buzz. So these different versions of the coverage already had a history by the 1970s. To understand why you'd want to have 3 different ways to run cover 3, let's look at 2 back-to-back plays from this Kent State-Ohio game. On this play, Kent State's going to run that sky rotation with the safety dropping down to defend the flats, and the linebacker inside of him dropping to defend the inside hook. Here the offense is going to get a completion by attacking that linebacker, who starts the play lined up over the tight end. After the snap, keep an eye on the running back that's lined up to that guy's side. As the play starts, we see him start to fire out to the edge, almost as if to block that linebacker on some kind of run play. When he does this, it causes that linebacker to hesitate as he reads the backfield, deciding whether to come up and set the edge against the run, or to drop out and defend his hook zone against the pass. To take advantage of this, Ohio's releasing their tight end inside of that linebacker and into the hook, and this creates a problem. On the one hand, he has a back that looks like he's releasing out to the perimeter. On the other, he's got that tight end releasing inside and downfield. He hesitates, there's no defender in the hook, and the tight end gets open behind him. Ohio picks up 16 yards before Saban comes up from the deep middle and combines with Jack Lambert to make the tackle. Happy with that success, on the next play, Ohio runs the exact same passing concepts. Now remember that on the last play, we saw Kent State defending it with a sky rotation, with that strong safety dropping down to play as the short outside defender in the flat, while the strong side linebacker played the next zone inside of him. With that coverage rotation, we saw that linebacker get caught in between 2 offensive players, a running back who released out wide to the edge, and a tight end who released inside and down the field. To eliminate that conflict, Kent State's going to switch to a buzz rotation in this play, with that strong side linebacker dropping out to defend the flat. By doing this, they're saying, okay, you're purely a perimeter defender now. You're not responsible for that inside hook zone anymore. With that linebacker playing on the perimeter then, the strong safety is going to drop down to replace him in the hook zone. As we see right here, that puts him directly over the tight end's route, giving the defense a much better distribution of defenders against this passing concept. What we've seen here then is that while almost all zone coverage played with 3 deep and 4 underneath zones, that didn't mean that your defenders were always dropping to the same spots or doing the same things. Within that 3 deep world, there were a variety of different adjustments or tools that the defense could use to take away whatever the offense was trying to do. Then you can also mix in your man, combination, and blitz coverages along with all of their variations, and you've got a pretty good variety of calls to work with. With all that in mind, there's one more detail about pass defense at this time that we need to remember. During this period, it was reasonably common for the free safety or for some player in the secondary rather than a coach to be the guy making all these coverage calls. I don't have a source saying that that's what Saban did at Kent State, but that pass defense book that I quoted earlier describes the kind of role that a play caller in the secondary might have. The defensive secondary quarterback should know the strong points of the opposition's passing attack as well as the strong and weak points of each of our pass coverage calls. He must be a strategist and be able to anticipate the opponent's attack and their favorite sequence of passes. We want our playing secondary coordinator to constantly mix up our defensive coverage patterns as a defensive change-up in attacking the opposition's offensive planning. This kind of system was hardly new when Olcott published his book in 1970. 10 years earlier, in that Bear Bryant book that I mentioned, he described the system of signals that his secondary play caller used to put the coverage into different rotations. Now, let's compare Olcott's quote to what Carol James, Don James's wife, said about Saban as a player. He knew that Nick studied the game. He knew the game plans. He studied the opposing team. It wasn't just a kid who went out and played. He really studied every week who they were playing, and he practiced, executed, and did all those things you have to do to be a good player, but also to be a good coach. Whether Saban was calling coverages or not at this time, he played in James' defense in 1971 and 72, and when he graduated, he thought that his football career was over. It was at that point that Don James changed the course not just of Saban's career, but also of defensive football. Nick Saban's first break in coaching came when he didn't even want it. Here's how he remembers the story. I never wanted to be a coach. I wanted to be the general manager of a car dealership because my dad had a service station and I grew up working on cars and all that kind of stuff. Don James calls me into his office one day and says, I want you to be a GA next year. I said, I don't want to be a GA. I don't want to go to graduate school. I'm sick of going to school. And he said, we have a new secondary coach. I'd like for you to go through spring practice because you know what we do on the back end and you could probably be helpful to the guy a little bit as he learns the system. Speaking of his wife Terry, who still had a year to go before graduation, Saban adds, we'd promised our parents that we'd both graduate, and she wanted to graduate, and I wanted her to graduate. So that's the only reason I did it, and I loved it, and it worked out really, really well. And so, Saban got his coaching start as a grad assistant at his alma mater, helping to teach Kent State's coverage package to a new defensive backs coach. As a GA, he spent 2 years in a variety of roles, helping out with the defensive backs, evaluating recruiting film, leading campus visits for recruits, and serving as the defensive coordinator of the freshman team. Here's how a fellow assistant remembers Nick Saban, freshman defensive coordinator. He stayed on top of them constantly. He was very competitive. I can remember during the freshman games, he'd yell at them, do the right thing and do it right now. He made the transition to an authority figure and was all business. Saban held that GA role for 2 years, but after the 1974 season, Don James got hired away by Washington and moved on to his Hall of Fame career with the Huskies. James advocated for varsity defensive coordinator Dennis Fitzgerald to replace him, and Kent State listened. Fitzgerald then gave Saban his first real assistant job when he promoted him to linebacker coach for a salary of $8,000 a year. That job would be the first in a series of brief stops for Saban in the 70s and early 80s. After 2 years working for Fitzgerald, he left to coach linebackers at Syracuse for a year, and then got back into the secondary at West Virginia under Frank Cignetti Sr., who later went on to a Hall of Fame career at Division II IUP, where he had a 78% winning percentage in 2 decades as head coach. After 2 years with Cignetti at West Virginia, Saban moved on to 2 seasons at Ohio State, and then 1 at Navy. During this time, it wasn't the specific jobs that made the difference so much as the connections that Saban made while working them. At Syracuse, he was on a staff with future Giants head coach and Super Bowl winner Tom Coughlin, as well as Jerry Angelo, who'd spent 11 years as GM for the Chicago Bears. Most important for Saban's career arc, though, was Syracuse defensive coordinator Dennis Friesel. 5 years before Friesel would meet Saban at Syracuse, he was the defensive coordinator at the University of Tampa, where his boss was Earle Bruce, the 3rd Hall of Fame coach that Saban would end up working for. In 1979, Bruce was chosen to replace Woody Hayes at Ohio State, and he brought his buddy Friesel over to be the defensive coordinator. In their first year in Columbus, they had a young defensive backs coach by the name of Pete Carroll, but when Carroll moved on to a coordinator position of his own, Bruce and Friesel brought Saban over to replace him. Being the defensive backs coach at Ohio State was Saban's biggest opportunity up to that point and his first brush with real championship football. The Buckeyes were still strong after 28 years under Hayes, and in the 11 seasons before Bruce took over, they'd won 9 Big Ten championships, 2 Rose Bowls and an Orange Bowl, and had claimed 2 national titles. With Bruce, they seemed poised to keep right on rolling, going 11-1 and making it to the Rose Bowl in the season right before Saban joined the program. At the same time, on the field, the Big Ten was starting to change schematically. In 1978, the year before Bruce took over, 3 Big Ten quarterbacks had finished in the top 25 nationally. The conference's leading passer, Ed Smith of Michigan State, finished 9th in the country while throwing for just over 2,200 yards. Only 2 years later, in Saban's first year with the Buckeyes, 2 conference rivals had taken massive leaps forward. At Illinois, under new head coach Mike White, Dave Wilson finished 2nd in the country by throwing for more than 3,100 yards. Right behind him in 3rd place, Purdue's Mark Herman threw for just under 3,000. The top of the conference, at least, was suddenly a lot more dangerous through the air. As the defensive backs coach in charge of stopping these teams, Saban was paying close attention, especially when Illinois set an NCAA record with 621 yards and 6 touchdowns against his secondary. Saban saw that Big Ten passing offenses were only getting stronger, and he wanted to make changes, a fact that brought him into frequent conflict with Bruce. Here's how assistant Steve Szabo remembers it. Saban wanted to do things in coverage that were a bit more sophisticated, looking for a better way. Earle was sort of back in the 1970s. He felt like a strong safety should be a guy like Jack Tatum, a big guy, but Nick believed the safeties had to be multi-talented guys, had to be able to play the pass in a zone or even man-to-man coverage. Nick made some statements a couple of times during staff meetings that were really offensive to Earle. When he said them, you could hear a pin drop in the room. I wish I could show you what the Buckeye secondary looked like at this time. Apparently in the 81 Michigan game, Saban was allowed to develop a coverage plan to shut down receiver Anthony Carter, and it'd be really interesting to see what was different about that game compared to others. But unfortunately, a lot of the broadcast angles for this time are completely worthless, right? Good luck studying the passing game when you can't even see the linebackers. Another source of tension for Saban was the relationship between Bruce and Dennis Friesel, Saban's old colleague from Syracuse, who apparently wasn't doing him any favors either schematically or politically. Here's Szabo again. Denny was off the wall. He was a gambler. He called a game by picking plays out of a hat. Nothing about him was structured. Denny loved to be a big-timer. He was out there rubbing elbows with the money people and the boosters at the school, trying to be in the same social circles as Earle. I think that rubbed Earle the wrong way. None of that sounds like a healthy situation for a 30-year-old defensive assistant, and things only got worse in 1981. That year, Illinois threw for 370 yards, Purdue threw for 516, and in the Liberty Bowl, Navy doubled up on their season average, causing Bruce to fire 4 assistants, including Friesel and Saban. Here's how he remembers it. It was really nothing Nick did. It was just that he'd gotten really close to Friesel. Friesel was my best friend in coaching. We went to the track together. Our families were close. Do you hear me? But I thought it was time I moved on. I told him, you can get a new job and take that guy with you because he's attached to your hip. And so, after 2 seasons and a bunch of passing yards surrendered, Saban's time in Columbus came to an end. It'd be the first and only time that he was ever fired from a coaching job. Again, though, it wasn't the specific jobs that made Saban's career during this time, it was the connections that he made in them, and in the end, getting fired from Ohio State just opened the door to meet another of the most influential coaches in his career, an up-and-coming assistant with the New York Giants by the name of Bill Belichick. When Saban had been at West Virginia before his time at Ohio State, the defensive coordinator was a man named Gary Tranquill. Tranquill stayed with the Mountaineers when Saban left, but in 1982 he got the job as head coach at Navy. When Saban got fired from Ohio State, Tranquill was more than happy to bring him over and even expanded his responsibilities. Quote, Nick kinda ran the defense. I didn't have a defensive coordinator in name, really. Title or no title, Saban's ambition at just 30 years old was obvious to his players, as defensive back Mark Brodowitz remembers. The rumor we all heard when he came in is that he wanted to be the youngest defensive coordinator in the country. Saban was only at the Naval Academy for a year, but during that time he got close with Steve Belichick, who'd been a longtime assistant and scout with the program going all the way back to the 50s. He literally wrote the book on scouting football, and I'll put that in the description box down below if you want to check it out. In the summer, Steve's son Bill, who was working under Bill Parcells with the Giants, would stop by Annapolis. As Saban says, Bill used to come home in the summer and visit his parents, and same age, same young guys trying to come up in the business, we just sort of naturally became friends. Underlying that friendship was a high level of respect, which had been earned by Saban from Steve and then been passed on to his son Bill. My dad had seen a lot of coaches come through the Naval Academy, so when he would say to me, "This is one of the best coaches I've worked with," I always kept that in the back of my mind. Over the next 8 years, Saban and Belichick could continue to meet up and talk football, and this relationship became key to the development of Saban's defensive scheme. That wouldn't happen right away, though, and before we get there, we need to talk about another Super Bowl winning mentor that impacted Saban along the way. After just one season as the de facto defensive coordinator at Navy, Saban's next big break came from a Super Bowl winning assistant that he'd met during his long run of assistant jobs in the 70s. At some point during that time, he was able to get into the facility of the Pittsburgh Steelers, where former college teammate Jack Lambert was starting his Hall of Fame career as middle linebacker in the Steel Curtain defense led by Bud Carson. Pittsburgh's defensive line coach at the time was a man named George Perles, who'd end up winning 4 Super Bowls as part of that Steelers staff. Here's how Perles remembers Saban's visits. He'd just hang around the team and watch film and watch practice and talk to the coaches. I have no idea how he got in, but he was there a lot, just soaking it all in. We'd have a beer sometimes after practice, and he'd just pick my brain about football. I liked him. Perles was a Michigan State alum who'd played for the Spartans in their glory years under head coach and 4-time national champion Duffy Daugherty. Since Daugherty's retirement in 1972, the Spartans had gone through 3 mediocre coaches in 10 years. Perles was an alum who'd just won 4 Super Bowls, and so in 1983 they brought him back to East Lansing as head coach. Apparently his budget wasn't all that it could have been, though, and Saban benefited. I didn't hire him because of his past record. He'd been fired at Ohio State, but that didn't bother me. I needed a secondary coach at the time, and he came to mind. He was a friend socially. I didn't have much money to pay my guys. I paid all my assistants $30,000 a year. I couldn't just go out and get anyone I wanted. And so, in 1983, Saban signed on to coach defensive backs for the Spartans. Perles didn't name a defensive coordinator that year, but after one season it was clear that Saban was the man for the job, and the title was his. In that Michigan State defense, we see 2 features that define the Steel Curtain of the 70s, with the first being a frequent use of Bud Carson's version of Cover-2. Earlier, we talked about a typical 3-deep zone coverage, with 3 defenders playing over the top, and 4 playing underneath, with 2 of those underneath defenders playing outside in the flats, while the other 2 played inside in the hook zones. Already back in 1972, we saw Sam DeLuca, that former Chargers and Jets player, saying that those underneath defenders really weren't enough to cover the short zones against a good passing attack. At the same time, there were many receivers in the NFL that you simply couldn't cover man-to-man for a whole game. So, at a time when many college teams were mixing things up by playing less zone and trying to get tighter coverage, professional teams were starting to use more zone in order to get better matchups against certain receivers and route combinations. Most notably, the 1972 Dolphins produced the only perfect season in NFL history, and they did it by playing mostly zone. What the passing offenses of the 60s and 70s had really done then was force defenses at every level to be more multiple. Of course, that didn't solve the problem that DeLuca mentions, with 4 underneath defenders being unable to cover the field from sideline to sideline. Cover-2 provided one solution to this problem. In this coverage, the defense sends just their 2 safeties deep, and they divide the field into halves. With both safeties defending the entire deep field, both of your cornerbacks were then free to come up and defend the flats, combining with your 3 linebackers to give you 5 underneath defenders, though as we'll see, the Steelers modified this a little bit. While giving you those 5 defenders underneath, those cornerbacks were also able to play tighter to the wide receivers than they could as deep defenders in cover 3, and this gave the defense a hard edge to each side of the field against screens, outside runs, and quick passes. Now, the Steelers didn't invent cover 2. Safety Dick Anderson talks about running a 2-deep, 5-under zone with the 72 Dolphins, and Don James mentions learning something similar back in 1965 from LSU defensive coordinator Bill Belichick. The success of the Steel Curtain did do a lot to popularize the coverage, though, and through former Steeler Tony Dungy and his assistants like Monty Kiffin and Lovie Smith, their version spread around the league, becoming widely known as the Tampa 2 after their work with the Buccaneers in the late 90s. To understand this version of the coverage and how Saban ran it at Michigan State, we need to talk a little bit more about zone defense, how and when it works, when it fails, and how coaches have tried to modify it to eliminate some of its weaknesses. When most people hear the term zone, they think of what's called a spot drop or a landmark zone. In this kind of coverage, defenders have a landmark or an aiming point that they're working to. They drop on an angle to that aiming point, they read the quarterback's eyes and shoulders, and they break on the ball as soon as he sets up to throw it. Whether this kind of zone will work or not is all about time and space. Let's think about cover 3 with its 4 defenders and underneath coverage. A football field is 53 1/3 yards wide, and so if you have 4 underneath defenders, each of them has to cover a zone that's roughly 13 1/3 yards wide. If you put each player in the middle of his zone, then that means that he has to be able to cover a little more than 6.5 yards in either direction before the quarterback can get the ball to his receiver. If all of your defenders can cover that much space in that much time, then the coverage will work. Whether they can do that or not, though, is significantly impacted by the quarterback himself. If he doesn't telegraph his passes, has a quick release, and throws with good velocity, then he can make it a lot harder or even impossible for them to cover that much space in that little time. When facing this kind of challenge, it's tempting to start cheating or looking for ways to cover that space faster. For example, maybe instead of dropping to your landmark and reading the quarterback, you start running to a receiver the second he enters your zone. I've used the term cheating here to describe this kind of coverage, but in reality, this is a style of zone that goes back at least to the 30s, if not before, and it describes a lot of modern zone coverages as well, as we'll see soon. While this approach of jumping receivers within your zone makes sense, it does come with its own set of risks. Let's say, for example, that the running back to this side of the diagram releases out wide into the flat, and that the tight end runs a route inside and over the ball. Now, let's say that the defenders in those zones work to jump those guys immediately, running with them as soon as they enter their zones. Remember that in our spot drop or landmark zone, those two defenders were only 13 1/3 yards apart, with each guy having to cover a little more than 6.5 yards to close up that space. When those defenders cheat or match receivers, as we're seeing here though, they can end up more than 26 yards apart. A good offensive coordinator is going to see this and attack it by dropping a third receiver right in the middle of that area. By trying to cheat to receivers and take away space, then those defenders have actually opened up more space, making it even easier for a good quarterback to complete passes. This brings us then to the question that drove Saban and all of his mentors from the 70s, 80s, and 90s on through to today, and that is, how do you play a sound zone coverage while still taking away space against a good passing attack? One answer came from the version of Cover-2 developed by Bud Carson, the defensive coordinator of that Steel Curtain defense that Jack Lambert and George Perles were a part of. Here, we're looking at some All-22 footage of his defense from 1979 after he left the Steelers and joined the Rams. Part of the way that this coverage eliminated space was by rerouting receivers, limiting their ability to get to certain areas of the field and funneling them into tight spaces where defenders were waiting for them. Here's how Steeler linebacker Andy Russell described it in The Games That Changed the Game, an awesome football history book that I'll link to in the description box down below. Rerouting was done in man-to-man, even if we did have deep guys playing zone. It was a matchup zone. If a guy came into your zone, you didn't back off, you covered him right away. In this coverage, the cornerbacks were responsible for taking away most throws to the sidelines. If their men released inside, as we're going to see here, then the cornerbacks would stay outside of them, preventing them from breaking back out and eliminating all of the space between themselves and the sideline. Another thing that we're seeing on this rep is common to lots of versions of Cover-2, and that is that the cornerbacks are dropping with those receivers to a depth of almost 10 yards before passing them off to the deep safeties. The goal here is to shrink the amount of space that those safeties have to cover. When the cornerbacks get depth like this, they put themselves underneath any intermediate outside breaking routes. If the quarterback wants to throw to one of those receivers, then he'll have to throw it over the top of the cornerbacks, giving the safeties better angles and more time to make a play on the ball. Finally, the last thing that we're seeing here is that even though the cornerbacks are dropping with the guys on the outside, they're also letting them go. Here we see them looking back inside toward the offense's other receivers and toward the quarterback. If one of those inside receivers were to break out to the flat, and if the quarterback were to target that guy, then the cornerback could come up to defend the short outside zone. In this way, a Cover-2 cornerback has to do almost double duty. His goal is to take away most of the sideline, both by dropping underneath of any deep outside breaking routes, while also being ready to come up and defend shorter outside breaking routes in the flat. While the cornerbacks are doing this on the outside, taking away space down the sidelines and trying to force everything in, the outside linebackers are doing the opposite, dropping with any inside receivers and trying to force them to go out. If we look at the tight end, for example, we see that he's starting this play off inside the right hash, and that he's got the strong side linebacker playing directly over him. After the snap, to release off the line and get away from that defender, he's going to take an outside release. And the linebacker is going to get hands on him and force him to go even wider, so that he ends up roughly halfway between the hash mark and the numbers. When we think of this from the perspective of that deep safety behind him, we see that with the cornerback taking away most throws to the sideline and the linebacker driving his man well outside of the hash, the amount of space that he actually has to cover is a lot smaller than a true half of the field. At the same time, much like the cornerbacks, here we see the outside linebackers passing off their receivers as they continue to go vertical, sitting down and looking up other receiving threats in the quarterback, putting themselves in position to jump these routes by the running backs as they come out of the backfield. Finally, the most distinctive feature of the Carson Cover-2 comes from this middle linebacker. Remember that we just saw that the cornerbacks and outside linebackers were trying to make a funnel, with the cornerbacks forcing receivers inside away from the sideline, and the linebackers forcing them outside away from the hash. Well, the other place where Cover-2 will have a lot of space is down the middle of the field in between those two deep safeties. And so what the Carson Cover-2 is going to do is take that middle linebacker and drop him into that hole, making sure that the safeties also don't have to worry about routes attacking that intermediate middle. As we watch this play one last time, keep an eye on that tight end again, and we'll see how this all comes together. Remember that after the snap, he's releasing outside to get away from the linebacker that's playing over him. As he continues downfield, that linebacker gets hands on him and forces him outside of the hash toward that deep safety that's waiting for him over the top. Once the tight end clears that linebacker, though, he's free to break back inside over the middle, a route that could potentially widen the space that safety has to cover again. Rather than causing a problem for that guy, though, in the Carson Cover-2, that route's going to get picked up by the middle linebacker, who's dropping into perfect position to take it away. As we saw with the cornerbacks on the outside, if the quarterback wants to throw to that tight end down the middle, he's going to have to beat the middle linebacker over the top, creating better angles and more time for the safeties to make a play on the ball. When Saban was calling the defense for Perles at Michigan State, then, we see that this Carson Cover-2 was a common tool. Here, we'll run into the 80s camera angle issue a little bit, but we can still see all the key elements of the coverage in an interesting showdown between Saban's defense and an Iowa offense run by Bill Snyder, who was here just a few years from starting a Hall of Fame career of his own at Kansas State. On this play, we see Iowa in a two-back set with the quarterback under center and a tight end lined up down toward the bottom of the screen. After the snap, that tight end is going to release vertically down the field, and the running back on the opposite side is going to try to run an angle route, breaking outside before cutting back in over the middle. As we now know, in the Carson Cover-2, it'll be up to the outside linebackers to close space on those inside receiving threats. And so to see this at work in Saban's Michigan State defense here, let's start by looking at the matchup on the tight end. After the snap, that guy gets a good inside release and starts to push vertical. As we see here, though, the linebacker playing over him isn't just dropping to a landmark and reading the quarterback. He's tracking that release and working to get hands on his man. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the field, we see that running back starting to get into his route as well, and the outside linebacker playing over him is also widening so that he can get a reroute on that receiver. Now, since the camera angle is pretty tight here, let's cut over to the end zone angle to see what's really going on. Before the snap, the tight end's just out of frame to the left of the formation. As we run it forward, we'll see him come into the shot, and we'll see the outside linebacker putting hands on him to try and force him out of the seam. Meanwhile, if we go back to the start of the play, we see that number 41 here is the middle linebacker. After the snap, he's going to drop to take away that intermediate hole over the middle, tracking the tight end and watching for him to attack that deep space in between the safeties. Later in the down, though, the tight end will break his route to the outside. This takes him away from that middle linebacker's responsibility, and so that defender instead looks back to cover other threats to that area. Now, for the last piece of the play, remember that this running back to the right side of the formation will be running an angle route, releasing wide out of the backfield before trying to bang it back inside into the middle. As we also saw, the outside linebacker, who's just barely in frame here, is going to be working to collision him. They're going to go off screen briefly here, but when they come back on, we're going to see that outside linebacker maintaining his inside position on that man. The quarterback expects his running back to break open into the middle of the field underneath the deep drop by that middle linebacker. Because of this, he's already thrown the ball in this shot, trying to put it over the top of the player that's rerouting that man. Instead, though, that linebacker undercuts the route, jumping to tip the ball up where that middle linebacker in the intermediate middle nearly comes down with the interception. As we'll soon see, the Carson Cover-2 wouldn't be a long-term solution for Saban in pass defense, so there'll be other influences that we need to look at to trace his development through the air. In the defensive front, though, he would stick much longer with the second key feature of the Steel Curtain defense, the so-called Stunt 4-3, which Perles himself had developed as the Steelers' defensive line coach, and which was partly responsible for putting Steelers nose tackle Joe Green into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. In the Stunt 4-3, George Perles had developed a complex defensive package featuring a variety of stunts and twists along the defensive line. Its most identifiable feature, though, was the frequent use of a tilted alignment by Hall of Fame nose tackle Joe Green. Here, Green's the defensive tackle toward the bottom of the screen. It's hard to see from the sideline, but instead of lining up over a specific blocker, he's lined up in a tilted stance in the gap between the center and right guard, and his goal here is to command a double team. If he can shoot into that gap and make it impossible for the center to cut him off, then the only way to block him will be to bring the right guard over to double team him. When the right guard blocks Green like this, Pittsburgh can then take the other defensive tackle from the opposite side of the formation and twist him around that block. With the right tackle blocking out on the defensive end and the right guard coming down to double Green, that guy loops right in between them, creating a one-on-one situation with a running back who is in no way equipped to block him. Long after Saban left Perles' staff, targeted stunts and twists like this gave him a way to flex his game planning and play calling ability. After all, it's not enough to tell two guys to twist. For a twist to be effective, you have to know what blocking schemes your opponent will run, how many blockers they're going to have in different places, and how your twist will impact those blockers. As a great example of this, here's a play from Saban's first head coaching job at Toledo in 1990. When we look at the defensive tackle to the center's left, we see him in that same tilted alignment that we saw from Joe Green in the 70s, and he's trying to shoot straight into the backfield to cause penetration and disruption. To get away from that guy and away from the teeth of Toledo's defense, Central Michigan's running a wide zone lead play to the left. So they're going to take the fullback right here, and they're going to send him to the perimeter to block Toledo's strong safety. And then they're going to pitch the ball out to the running back who's looking to get wide and cut up inside of that block. Once you know that this is what you need to stop, then you can start thinking about when your twist game can give you an advantage at the point of attack. In this blocking scheme, for example, Central Michigan will end up with 4 blockers to the left of center: the fullback, tight end, left tackle, and left guard. From this pre-snap alignment, Toledo looks like they can get 5 defenders to that side, which would give them a one-man advantage. Against this wide play, they're going to be able to involve their strong safety on the perimeter. They've got 3 guys on the line with their nose tackle, defensive end, and strong side linebacker. And then they have a middle linebacker as a 5th defender at the second level who should be able to pursue across the formation as long as nobody cuts him off. So how can Central Michigan get a 5th blocker to cut off that middle linebacker? Well, one guy who'd have a shot at it would be the center himself. When we look at this pre-snap image, we see that the center is just barely lined up inside of the hash. The middle linebacker's outside the hash, and so if the center could get around the nose tackle and climb to the second level, he could potentially cut that guy off. By putting that tilt nose tackle directly over the center, though, they're really taking this kind of block away. As we know, that defender's goal is to shoot the gap and fly into the backfield, and so the center really needs to block him to cut off that penetration, holding the center up at the line of scrimmage and preventing him from climbing to the middle linebacker. Okay, so if the center can't cut off that middle linebacker, then who can? The natural choice to block that guy would be the left guard. The left guard's even closer to the play than the center is, and on top of that, he's not covered by a defensive lineman, so he'll be able to get clean up to the second level with a great angle to cut off the middle linebacker. So what does Toledo do? They use that same twist that we saw from the Steelers. With the left guard climbing to cut off the middle linebacker, they're going to take the backside defensive tackle and twist him right into the space that he's vacating, letting him run down the play in pursuit. When we see Saban running this kind of thing later in his career, there's no doubt that the foundation of this attacking style of defensive line comes from Perles. In Saban's 1997 playbook, the Stunt 4-3 is the second front given, with a tilt nose tackle lined up in the guard center gap and all, and a lot of the terms for different stunts are identical to what Perles was teaching at Michigan State. This stunting, twisting 4-3 front would continue to be Saban's base defense until he left college for the Dolphins in 2006. In Saban's 5 years with Perles, the Spartans went 32-24-2, culminating in a 9-2-1 record and a Rose Bowl victory in 1987. After that year, the Packers made a run at Perles, and it was understood that Saban would take over if he left. Perles stayed, though, and Saban, who wanted to be a head coach, started looking for his next opportunity. He was a candidate to be the head coach at his alma mater, Kent State, but didn't end up getting chosen. What he did get was a chance to coach in the NFL, working as the defensive backs coach for the Houston Oilers under Jerry Glanville, the culmination of all of those coaching relationships that Saban had built in the 70s and 80s. Although Glanville never worked for the Steelers, he had a lot of connections to the organization. His first mentor was a man named Raleigh Deutsch, who'd been a teammate of Perles at Michigan State and who coached the Steelers' offensive line from 1978 to 81. Early in his career, Glanville had also been a defensive assistant at Georgia Tech under head coach Bud Carson, who later became the Steelers' defensive coordinator and creator of that Carson Cover-2 defense that we looked at. In 1988, then, when Glanville was scouting the Senior Bowl, he went out to dinner with Tony Dungy and Joe Green, two Steeler players who'd returned to the organization as assistants. At that dinner, Glanville mentioned that he needed a defensive backs coach, and they both recommended Saban. In addition, Glanville worked with Bill Belichick for the Lions in 1976, and Belichick obviously recommended Saban as well. So it came to pass that in 1988, Saban left Michigan State for the Oilers, where he stayed for 2 seasons. Another perk that Saban got from his time at Houston was that Glanville actually helped him land his first head coaching job with Toledo. Glanville interviewed with the Rockets a few years earlier, and when Saban was up for the job, Glanville helped him prepare. According to Glanville, when Saban got back, he told him, quote, "Every question they asked me was one we'd practiced." Saban's first year as a head coach was highly successful, as his Toledo Rockets finished 9-2 and tied for first in the MAC. In that 1 year, he also started a pretty impressive coaching tree. His defensive coordinator was Dean Pease, who'd go on to call defenses for the Patriots and the Ravens, with a highlight being a Super Bowl win in 2012. At defensive backs coach, he had Phil Parker, who'd played for him under Perles at Michigan State, and who's currently the defensive coordinator at Iowa, where he's called 10 top 25 defenses in the last 12 years and finished in the top 10 5 times. In spite of that success, after just 1 year, Saban was presented with an opportunity that he couldn't turn down: the chance to call an NFL defense for Bill Belichick, who'd just been named head coach of the Browns. That time with Belichick, along with the Stunt 4-3 that he'd learned from Perles, would give Saban much of the foundation for the defense that he ran at LSU when he won his first national championship in 2003. For the rest of that story, though, check back to the Coordinator Project in 2 weeks when I'll post the second video in this series on becoming Saban.